Today our topic is classification keys, unit 3.1. Our objectives will be to define classification keys, to describe the importance of classification key, and to understand how to construct a classification key. A classification key. A key is a set of questions about the characteristics of living things. You can use a key to identify a living thing or decide which group it belongs to by answering the questions. In simple words, we use classification keys to classify a new organism or an unknown organism. Students and professionals use the dichotomous key, also called as the classification key, to identify and classify objects such as people, animals, plants, bacteria, etc. into specific categories based on their characteristics. It's the most commonly used form of classification or type of identification key used in biology, as it simplifies identifying unknown organisms. What is a dichotomous key? A dichotomous key means dichotomous means divided into two parts. Hence, the dichotomous key always presents two choices based on the key characteristics of the organism in each step. By correctly selecting the right choice at each stage, the user will be able to identify the name of the organism at the end. The further you divide the key, the more you learn about the specimen you are trying to identify. Factors to be considered. When creating a dichotomous key, both qualitative and quantitative factors are considered. Qualitative factors means the physical attributes are the physical characteristics such as how the organism looks, what color it is, etc. And quantitative factors means the number of legs, weight, height, etc. So there are two factors which are involved in identifying an organism. One is their qualitative and the other one is the quantitative factors. As their name describes, qualitative means the physiological, the physical characteristics, and quantitative means the numbers, the quantity of their characteristics, like for example, as the example is giving, the number of legs, weight, height, etc. What is the dichotomous key used for? A dichotomous key is usually used for identifying and categorizing organisms, helping students easily understand harder scientific concepts, organizing large amount of information to make identification of an organism much easier. So basically there are some basic rules for which this dichotomous key is used. One is the categorizing organism, like as I told you before, the new organism or the unknown organism found is categorized by this key. And to help the students to learn new scientific concepts and to gather more and more information about that organism. How to make a dichotomous key? Below we have listed the steps you need to follow when creating a dichotomous key. Let's start them one by one. Step 1. List down the characteristics. Pay attention to the specimen you are trying to identify with your dichotomous key. List down the characteristics that you can notice. For example, say you are trying to classify a group of animals. You may notice that some have feathers whereas others have legs, or some have long tails and others don't have. So on the basis of these characteristics we are going to categorize that animal, that to which group that animal belongs, by asking simple questions. Step 2. Organize the characteristics in order. The characteristics which you noticed in that organism, the physical characteristics, are the numerical characteristics. first you have to do to organize them in order. Like for example, when creating your dichotomous key, you need to start with the most general characteristic first before moving to the more specific ones. So it helps to have identified the more obvious and less obvious contrasting characteristics among the specimens before creating your dichotomous key. So here you have to notice two things. One is the most general characteristics and the other one is the most specific ones. So moving from, you have to go from general to specific, not from specific to general. Divide the specimens. You can use statements like, for example, has feathers and no feathers, or they can be in the form of a question like, does it have feathers? To divide your specimens into two groups. The first differentiation should be made on the most general characteristics. As I told you before, you have to go from general to specific. Step 4. Divide the specimen even further. Like how? Based on the next contrasting characteristics. Divide the specimen further. For example, first you may have grouped your animals as have feathers and have no feathers, in which case the ones with feathers can be categorized as birds, while you can further subdivide the ones that have no feathers as having fur and having no fur. This is the second question. Continue to subdivide your specimen by asking enough questions until you have identified and named all of them. Like you have a list of specimens and you will be going to ask further questions. Like for example, in this example you have asked one question in the previous slide, that does the animal have feather or no feather. So if you find the answer of this question, then leave that organism, that specimen, and categorize that as a bird, and further move towards the next question. Like for example, the next question is, does the animal have a fur or no fur? So such that you have to move on by asking questions. Draw a dichotomous key diagram. Step 5. You can either create a text-based dichotomous key or a graphical one, where you can even use images of the specimen you are trying to identify. Here you can use a tree diagram or a flowchart as in the example below. We have two examples here. This one is the example of the text-based diagram, like dichotomous key, or a graphical one, text-based dichotomous key or a graphical one. So this one is the text-based dichotomous key. Here you can see some examples of organism A, B, C, D, E, and you have to identify them on the basis of the question asked in the table below. And this one is the diagrammatic representation of a dichotomous key. Like there are some classes of vertebrates, animal groups. There are some specimens like rabbit, fish, amphibian, reptile, birds. So mammals, fish, amphibian, reptile and birds, these are the specimens, and you have to ask questions and move further on. Step 6. Test it out. Once you have completed your dichotomous key, test it out to see if it works or not. Focus on the specimen you are trying to identify and go through the questions in your dichotomous tree to see if you get it identified at the end or not. If you think the questions in your dichotomous key needs to be arranged, make the necessary adjustment. That depends upon you. If you are not successful on the first time, make the question, shuffle the questions and try again. Best practices to keep in mind while drawing a dichotomous key. Consider only one characteristic at a time. Use morphological or observable characteristics as much as you can. Morphological or observable characteristic means the physical characteristics which can be seen with the naked eye, which you can see, which you can observe in that organism. Number 3, Use major characteristics when dividing the organism in the beginning, and use lesser or less obvious characteristics to divide them into smaller groups. As I told you before, that move from general to specific characters. When writing contrasting statements, rely on similar word formats, like for example, have feathers and don't have feathers. So in the previous slides we discussed this thing also, that ask questions on the basis of their physical characteristics, and you have to write the contrasting statements. Be specific in your statements and avoid repeating the same characteristic. Once you identify an organism on the basis of one character, like for example have feathers and don't have feathers, so don't repeat this statement again. So think about another questions. Use questions that lead to yes or no answers rather than statements. Thank you. If you have any question, ask me in the Zoom session.